I'd like to thank the program committee for inviting me to participate, and to all the behind-the-scenes crew for making this virtual conference possible. I want to set up some definition dominoes before I push them over and we watch how the individual pieces fit together. I expect most of us are familiar with the notion of diegetic music and the various terms and concepts that are framed in opposition to it. Even so, I'd like to begin by unpacking what I mean by this term, so I hope you'll bear with me. I find the very notion of diegesis to be a fascinating one, especially when the diegesis is subverted or altered in unexpected ways. For anyone unfamiliar with the term, diegetic sound, in its cinematic sense, is sound that the characters in the story can hear. This is also sometimes called source music because the music has a source within the world of the story. Frequently, screen music is non-diegetic, that is, it is underscoring. The music serves to help the audience understand the emotional trajectory of a scene, but the characters don't hear it. Here is a more formal definition of the term diegetic by Gerald Prince. But Kim Dillon's treatment is far more user-friendly. The sentence I've highlighted at the end of his description makes his, I think, more compelling. This bifurcation into diegetic and non-diegetic categories can be helpful in some circumstances, but sometimes composers and directors poke holes in that divide by deploying music in trans or multi-diegetic roles. We hear the limitations of this terminology in the following excerpt from the coin toss scene in No Country for Old Men. Here, the unwitting gas station clerk's life depends upon correctly calling a coin toss. The scene begins with no music, but plenty of tense silence in which we can hear the room tone, which is about 60 Hz. As the scene's suspense intensifies, Burwell gradually inserts music centered on B natural, in his words, to blend with the electrical hum of the station. When the coin is revealed, the slow crescendo suddenly cuts, only then revealing that the room tone, which would have been audible to the characters, had gradually transitioned to music that the characters would not have heard.
What's the most you ever lost on a coin toss?
Sir?
The most you ever lost on a coin toss?
I don't know. I couldn't say.
Call it.
Call it?
Yes.
For what?
Just call it.
Well, we need to know what we're calling it for here.
You need to call it. I can't call it for you. Well, it wouldn't be fair.
I didn't put nothing up.
Yes, you did. You've been putting it up your whole life. You just didn't know it. You know what date is on this coin?
No.
1958. It's been traveling 22 years to get here. And now it's here. And it's either heads or tails. And you have to say, call it.
Well, look, I need to know what I stand to win.
Everything.
How's that?
You stand to win everything, call it.
All right. Heads, then.
Well done.
Burwell gives a particularly subtle instance of transdiegetic sound in music, and one that requires a longer span of silence. However, practical and aesthetic considerations sometimes require other creative approaches to crossing the diegetic divide. In the course of this talk, I want to establish the use of linkage technique as a means of bridging the diegetic gap, using Rocksteady Studios' Batman Arkham Knight as an example of how this can be successfully accomplished. In this game, the player, as Batman, the world's greatest detective, must track down a serial killer, Professor Pig, who has murdered and displayed his victims around the city of Gotham. Professor Pig's obsession with operatic music becomes, in some respects, what Elizabeth Medina Gray has coined an earcon, a series of musical tones that operate in much the same way a sound effect would. This pseudo-operatic music can be heard when the player detective is within a certain radius of the crime scene. You'll be able to hear this in the following gameplay clip.
Alfred, I found a fourth victim.
The music serves to orient and draw the player to its source. The music's diegetic presence in the game world is not merely a superficial detail, but crucial to finding and solving all of the murders. Whereas soundtrack underscoring is not experienced within the narrative world, it is, in a sense, omnipresent. This music's diegesis is implicit in the use of digital filtering, simulating speakers or a radio as the source of the music, relative volume and reverberation, simulating the player's sense of distance to the musical source, and stereophonic sound production, simulating the player's sense of the direction of the musical source. I say all of this to firmly establish that it isn't just we, as the player or audience, who hear this music, but the character of Batman does as well. He must hear the music, or the integrity of the game world is impaired. Now let's talk about linkage technique, and then how it's connected to this game. Peter Smith has succinctly described the characteristic feature of linkage technique as the transformation of a gesture of conclusion into one of initiation. Linkage seems to have been particularly frequent in the music of Brahms, for example. As a point of departure, we'll consider two examples occurring in his Second Symphony. The third movement presents a fairly straightforward example. The motive used to link the end of one phrase to the beginning of the next maintains most, if not all, of its pitch class, rhythmic, registral, and timbral character. The first movement also presents a useful example, but one that displays greater timbral and rhythmic reframing of the melodic motive. It is this second example that sets a precedent for what we find in Batman Arkham Knight. We find that the neighboring figure, used as a gesture of closure in measures 42 and 43, is set up both motivically as a sequence and timbrally, being confined to the woodwinds, in measures 35 and 39. As closure, Brahms alters the pitch classes and doubles the length of the gesture, but maintains the melodic contour and timbral qualities. Linking to measure 44, he naturally uses the same pitch classes to initiate a new phrase, but this time with significant alterations to register, and perhaps most significantly, rhythm and timbre. This sampling of Brahms demonstrates one of the cardinal virtues of linkage, which is the preservation of the motivic gesture's specific pitch classes, especially when there are so few notes in the gesture. Linkage in video games presents special problems because game music is often nonlinear. That is, due to a player's agency, game music may need to continue in a particular state for an unspecified length of time, making it, to one degree or another, aleatoric. Video games also often use looped music, so that the end naturally seems to flow back to the beginning. This is problematic for a traditional understanding of linkage technique. If the player can elect to change the game state before the gesture has concluded, or perhaps before it has even occurred, then there can be no reliable gesture of closure. Most games get around this problem by simply cross-fading two distinct musical cues. Batman Arkham Knight takes a more musically sophisticated approach. You'll get an idea for this in the gameplay footage I'm about to show. The footage will also introduce you to what these two game states sound like. You've already heard the opera-esque music that can be heard during the default game state that allows Batman to freely roam. But when Batman needs to search for clues, the player, me in this case, initiates a new game state, which I'll refer to as detective mode, in which I must use Batman's arsenal of Bat-titled equipment to learn something about the victim. Detective mode is a changed game state accompanied by an utterly different soundscape, an oral cue to the player that detective mode is active.
They say the Bat tore through those airships like it was nothing. Some of those guys were lucky to make it out alive.
What we heard there was a crossing of the diegetic divide as the game state changed back and forth between free roam mode and detective mode. I've already mentioned the simulation of physical space in the perceived distance and direction of the aria-like music. We've established that this is diegetic. Contrast this with the sound of detective mode, in which the sound surrounds the player with no sense of distance or direction. The sound is imminent and enveloping, suggesting that it is we, not Batman, who can hear it. Perhaps you also heard some melodic similarities between the prominent descending gesture in the diegetic vocal line to the descending motive in the non-diegetic detective mode. It is this gestural reuse for which I posit that even though there may not be any reliable closure in the musical structure that then becomes a gesture of initiation, as Schenker would have known it, it does link a closure of one kind of space and time to the initiation of another. I mean this metaphorically and literally. Here is my transcription of the gesture as it is sung by the vocalist. There is enough other musical information in the accompaniment of this cue that one can determine the key, tempo, and meter. Thus it is quite perceptibly in real time, because we can easily count it. Then, linking to detective mode, the gesture undergoes a transformation that is in some ways similar to that second Brahms example we considered a moment ago. A drop in register, significant dynamic contrast, a change in timbral palette, and perhaps most tellingly, a dilation in rhythmic values. Long pedal tones, no discernible key, infrequent nods to any kind of pulse, and irregular note lengths all project a sense of timelessness without any orientation to another context. The linkage between these two cues operates on multiple levels. The first is perhaps more obvious, and is the recycling of pitch classes in stepwise descent. The second is the constancy of the tempo. The eighth note pulse, begun in one game state, remains consistent once the game state is changed, acting as metric linkage, even though the surface rhythms of the melodic gesture are altered. The third has to do with how the sound designers handled the aleatoric considerations of gameplay. After numerous trials, I've concluded that the detective mode cue loops silently in the background, so whenever the player initiates a game state change to detective mode, it will enter at whatever point in the loop it has currently reached. This still serves the linkage because the only pitches that occur in detective mode are those in the linkage gesture itself. There are no other distractions. Whenever the player initiates a game state change back to the aria loop always begins at its beginning as a kind of aleatoric da capo. This means that no matter what the player chooses to do, the linkage is always there. I surmise that linkage technique is used not merely out of convenience. From a game development standpoint, it would be easier to simply crossfade the two audio cues. From a technical standpoint, linkage serves to hide the seams between game states by keeping a steady pulse between the two and recycling pitch content. From a narrative and aesthetic standpoint, it serves as a connective thread between Batman's different awarenesses or attentions. When he hears the singer, we might infer that he is keenly aware of his dangerous surroundings. Sound effects are clearly heard. He listens in on enemy radio chatter, etc. In detective mode, Batman's unheard music supersedes all other sounds, including not only sound effects, but also the vocal music. This music is not to be interpreted as literally occurring in the same time and space occupied by the city of Gotham, but metaphorically as the atemporal thought space of Batman himself. The linkage between the vocalist's gesture and that of detective mode might suggest that on some level he is aware of the music, but its arguably sunny character is darkened as he broods on the violence he investigates. By using the very melodic gesture that led the player to the scene of the crime, the music invites the player into Batman's dark headspace.